Let's go back to the beginning. So, I don't know if anybody knows this, but vampires have been lurking in the shadows of human history since before we could write, since before tales were even painted on walls, okay? In ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Greeks, the Turks, and many other pre-Christian civilizations had stories about creatures who rose from the grave and craved human blood. As civilizations grew and spread, so did the stories. In the interest of time, we're going to skip ahead to 1462. Who knows who this is? Go.
Vlad the Impaler.
Vlad Tepes, also known as Vlad II, Vlad the Impaler, and Vlad Dracula, was the ruler of Wallachia. Okay? Stories of his brutality spread far and wide. And they were heard way outside of Eastern Europe. Okay? There's a lot of stories about Vlad. The most famous is that he supped on his dinner in a field surrounded by thousands of people on spikes, slowly screaming and dying as they slid down the pikes. That is the most famous tale of Vlad Dracula. Now, I have a podcast episode all about his history, but I'm just going to tell you this. Some of it I think was fabricated, but I think a lot of what he did was to stop the Turks from taking over his little area, and was to get some kind of control over the rampant crime in his area. So today, if you go to Romania, people either won't talk about him or they will tell you he was a hero, that he saved Romania. Who knows? But I will tell you this, 400 years later, his stories would inspire this author. Who's this?
Bram Stoker.
Bram Stoker. An Irish author. Shout out to the Irish.
Woo!
In 1897, he published Dracula. And I will tell you, it was not beloved by many. And it wasn't just because it was so gruesome. I'll tell you what it was. It was because 4 out of 5 of his vampires were females. 3 brides and Lucy. And they were aggressive, and they were sexual, and they went after what they wanted. So you can imagine in Victorian England, oh no, we can't have that. So it was very upsetting. People called it unnecessarily grotesque and gruesome. They thought it was going to make the women crazy because God forbid we ask for what we want. So I will tell you this, it changed vampire lore forever. If you talk about vampire lore, you talk about pre-Dracula and post-Dracula, okay? The first adaptation was in 1921. It was a silent film in Hungary, but all signs of it were destroyed because they did not get the rights to do it. Not long after, in Germany, a man would create Nosferatu. He changed just enough to kind of get away with it. But we all know if we watched it, the plot was exactly the same. The Stoker family went through legal battles, and it was dictated that it was supposed to be destroyed. But how many of you have seen it? Exactly. So, the filmmaker got away with what he wanted to get away with, which is he went down in history. However, 10 years later, in 1931, this would go from kind of a story that people kind of talked about to massively popular when an unknown Hungarian actor threw on a cape and seduced all of the women, and some of the men. Now suddenly, vampires were not something that you hoped would not come into your room at night. You kind of left the window open and thought, maybe, just maybe, he'll come visit me tonight. This changed things. In the next 124 years since this movie came out, Dracula has become the most portrayed fictional character in cinema. So we've seen a lot of Draculas, right? Who just played it? It just came out.
Nicolas Cage.
Nicolas Cage.
Nicolas Cage. Who saw it? What do we think?
Yes.
I love it. I thought it was hilarious. I thought this is Nick Cage, okay? If you went to go see something that wasn't Nick Cage, shame on you, because it's just Nick Cage with fangs. We all knew it was gonna happen. And they made it work. But this novel is not the only one that changed things, okay? In 1976, a little book came out. Want to guess? Interview with the Vampire. Anne Rice came out with this, and her vampires, with her books, became more sexy vampires. And, as many of us know, the first homosexual vampire couple, which no one would talk about in the 70s, but now, we all know that, right? I'm not shocking anybody in here. I just heard someone the other day say, oh my God, they made Interview with the Vampire gay. And I looked around and I said, it was always gay. Where were you? They got a kid to try and fix their toxic relationship. If that's not a marriage, I don't know where you've been. So that came out. But here's the thing that happened in the 80s. You no longer had to pick up a book to learn about sexy vampires. Right? Who's that?
David Bowie.
Go, you can shout it out.
It's Johnny Depp.
John Blaylock from The Hunger. The Lost Boys. Oh,
Yeah.
Michael.
Honest mistake.
Right? David, I think, is why I have a problem with Bad Boys today. Who's that?
Jerry Dandridge.
Jerry Dandridge. Whoo, buddy. Oh, yeah. There they are. And something else happened. We got sexy female vampires, finally. And that would continue on and remains very popular. Then we head into the 90s, and now you didn't have to go to the movie theater. You didn't even have to own HBO, right? Because now we got vampires on cable. How many of you watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. So, from 1997 to 2003, we got Buffy the Vampire Slayer, we got the Angel spinoff, we got Kindred, we got Forever Night. Who watched Forever Night? Right? What do we think about season 3? Awful, right? Then the turn of the century happened, the lovely 2000s. I got my first child, and we got vampires that sparkle, vampire warriors, vampire brothers, ancient vampires, and southern vampires.
Fun fact, this was Aaliyah's last film.
I know. I still can't watch it without getting sad. I know. And then we got plenty of remakes and reimaginings. We got vampires everywhere, right? Didn't anyone watch the Frog Boys in the Lost Boys sequel? Yeah, exactly. Nobody watched it. Exactly. And now suddenly we live in a world where vampires are everywhere. We've got vampire bands, vampire cafes, we've got vampires in kids shows, we've got vampire cereals, we've got vampire stores. Vampires are everywhere.
Even the Scooby-Doo cartoon
Yeah,
movies.
exactly. So we're gonna take a little detour here, right? Because what am I? I'm a scientist, I'm a professional, I'm a doctor-prepared person, so let's get serious here for a minute. Let's talk about history. Let's talk about vampires from all over the world. In ancient Greece and Rome, we had, oh, it's gonna go through on its own apparently. Pretend you didn't see that. We had succubi and incubi. Who knows what these are? They would come into your room at night, they would seduce you, and they would steal your vital fluids during intercourse. This has continued on to this very day, these tales. At one point, it was so prevalent that the church would tell their congregants, watch out, because if your husband strays, clearly it was a succubi, right? It's not him. They want to tempt you, they want to pull you into hell, they want to corrupt you, they want to lead you into sin. It was all blamed on succubi and incubi. Everyone asks me, so, are vampires real? So let's talk about this. We are going to do this in a scientific way. We are going to gather evidence, we're going to review it, we're going to come to a hypothesis. I have a theory, which I will share with you at the end, but I want you to come to your own thoughts, okay? Evidence 1, which we've already talked about. Vampires exist in every culture and every civilization. And this goes all the way back to a time when there was no way to get stories from civilization to civilization. So think about that. Now, if we go back geographically, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, they're all pretty close, right? There could be word of mouth. Someone could hook up with someone and pass the gossip, whatever. But what about China or India or the Nepalese, who all had legends of vampires that went back to a time before they were even passing notes? There was no Wi-Fi, there was no phone calls, there was no written books that could be sent across it. There was nothing. So how do these stories spread unless it's based on things people have seen or experienced? Question. I'm not trying to convince you, I'm just asking you to think about it. Exhibit B, eyewitness accounts. Let me tell you something that a doctorate will teach you. Research, 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 and always find the source. So a lot of the things I've compiled, I've taken back to the source, okay? So I want to talk about the very first written account of vampirism. Jure Grando bears the unique distinction of being the first man in history to be officially labeled as a vampire. His case is likely the first fully documented case of vampirism in world history. Documented. That means professionals, government officials sat down and did the paperwork saying this is a vampire. Grando lived in an Istrian village during the 17th century, and at that time, Istria was being controlled by the Italian Republic of Venice. This was a major commercial empire, okay? We're not talking a little tiny town where there's nothing to do but make stuff up. Grando was an ordinary man until he died. In 1656, he went from average to supernatural because according to many villagers, Grando was seen walking through the town of Kringa after death. Some claimed that he would knock on their doors at night, and before long, Gringan natives were calling him a strigan, which is the Italian word for vampire, also meaning wizard or witch. 9 men in total would finally descend upon his grave, open it up, find the corpse fully intact. This was 6 years after his death. After prayers and a wooden stake through the stomach failed, one member of the party chopped off Grando's head with an axe, which caused a tidal wave of blood to pour out of the corpse, and he was never seen walking again. And this is all documented from 9 different people. In 1725, in Serbia, in a village of Kisalava, there was a peasant named Peter. I'm not going to try and say that last name. He died of unspecified causes. However, the locals believe that 3 days later he was back. The story goes that Peter returned to the home of his son and demanded that the young man feed him. On this night, the son consented to his father's wishes, but then the next night, the son said no, and because of this, the son and 9 other villagers would die within the next week. Before their deaths, the villagers all complained about feeling exhausted. Some claimed to have seen Peter walking through the village at night, and these rumors so terrified a local priest that he contacted the local magistrate in hopes that he could investigate. The magistrates, who feared that a vampire panic would spread, contacted the Austrian army official. This officer exhumed Peter's grave and the graves of his suspected victims, found all of the bodies had no decay, and looked full of health and vitality. The army officer decided to drive stakes into all of their hearts, decapitated each corpse, and then went back to Belgrade, filed an official report that concluded that he had just destroyed vampires. So interesting, if you join my TikTok, I do random vampire facts, and one of them I talk about is where the garlic thing came from. And what it is garlic is a natural anticoagulant and a natural antiviral. So if you treat vampirism like a virus, I can see that that's where the garlic thing would come from. And also the Egyptians used to believe that garlic was a gift from God. So they believed that garlic would protect them because God had given it to them. So I will tell you that is one of my favorite tropes, the vampire versus werewolf. That is one of my favorite tropes. And I can see where there would be like sort of an underlying hatred between the two. But again, I think it would boil down to feeling ostracized from society, and you feel like you want to take it out on somebody, and they just kind of take it out on each other. Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you believe that vampirism in itself is a religion, or do you think that vampires have their own?
I think they're born that way. I do. I think most vampires are born that way. They don't recognize it right away, but they kind of come into their own and come into their power and start to recognize things that didn't make sense when they were younger. Actually, it's because they are vampires. So being in nursing, that's how I know there are ghosts. That's how I know. No, I've never come across one, but I also don't know that they would need to be in the hospital. I think they'd probably have their own healthcare. You know what I mean? We're going to be kicked out in 1 minute, but you guys can come.